Restoring Pinecastle, brought to you by Epic Homes. Pinecastle was established in 1874 by Will Wallace Hartley. Hartley was a well-educated writer, poet, teacher, attorney, and newspaperman. In 1869, Mr. Hartley traveled through the tough Florida interior by steamboat and ox cart with his wife and her family to Fort Gatlin, Florida, one of the many forts built around Florida during the Second Seminole Indian War. Upon arriving in Florida, Hartley chose to settle on the western shore of Lake Conway, where he cleared and cultivated around 5 acres. He began building a cabin, planting a garden, and putting in a small grove. It was in 1874, Hartley built his famous home, the Pinecastle, and began writing articles for the Cincinnati Commercial, which had the headline, Dateline, Pinecastle. Soon, the little town which grew up around Hartley's homestead became known as Pinecastle, Florida. Like Hartley, many of the first settlers built cabins next to Fort Gatlin. Here stands James J. Patrick next to the remains of one of the first cabins built on Lake Conway. When Hartley first arrived and settled in Pinecastle in the mid-1870s, there was only one road. It stretched from Fort Mellon in what is now Sanford, Florida, to Fort Gatlin. The path had been cleared of trees and debris, but the actual road was constructed with sand. This made for tough traveling on Florida's notoriously rainy days. When the sand was deep or muddy, it would make the travel almost impossible for a wagon to get through. 1875, when the town of Orlando first incorporated, it was immediate that residents began demanding that roads be built. To accomplish this, they were required to donate their own time and services or pay someone else to help build them. Finally, the new Orlando residents' complaints had been heard, and in the early 1880s, Ezra Frank Sperry was put in charge of building the first clay road between Orlando and Sanford. Soon there was a road from Orlando to Pinecastle and another to Conway. It is also well known that Joseph Bumby used these clay roads in the late 1800s to carry the Pony Express mail between these towns. After the Civil War, the soldiers started coming home and new families started to move south towards Central Florida. These pioneer families were looking for new opportunities and a chance to put the stresses of the Civil War behind them. More and more new families started to settle in Pinecastle, and with each new blossoming family there was a growing number of children. It was Will Wallace Harney who insisted that the children must be educated. So in 1874, Harney donated his own land for a brand new school to be built right in Pinecastle. The first one-room school was made of rough pine boards and rough pine benches made from the same trees Will Harney constructed his now famous Pinecastle home. With the creation of new roads, schools, and the expanding surrounding areas, in 1884 the railroad came to Pinecastle. Pinecastle was officially a town, and in 1900 the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Congressionalists worked together to build a church on Fairlane Avenue, which they all shared, something quite unheard of today. And in 1915, the local Baptists had finally raised enough money to build their own church on Hoffner Avenue. This was known as the Pinecastle Union Church, featured here in this photo. In and around the same time as the Union Church was built, a new 2-story schoolhouse was constructed in Pinecastle, and more pioneers moved to Pinecastle to build new beginnings with their families. Many homes were built in Pinecastle, some that still stand today, such as the Lancaster House, which was built a stone throw from Will Wallace Harney's original estate, and it was home to Pinecastle's first mayor, Arthur Lancaster. Here's the Lancaster House as it stands today. In the early 1900s, many things in Pinecastle started to change. New homes were built in Pinecastle. The Parton House, seen here, was on the east side of Lake Conway, where there is still a Parton Grove today. The beautiful Crawford House was built on Fairlane Avenue in 1919 by Paul Macy. The Crawford family lived in it for many years, and in 1981 it was moved across the street to become part of the Pinecastle Arts Center campus. And in 2014 it was moved again to 631 Wilkes Avenue, where it is now being developed as the Pinecastle Historical Museum. As the population in Pinecastle grew, it became more than just a few pioneers trying to live off the land. Farmers and early settlers started expanding their groves and realized that the land around the lakes was ideal for growing citrus. Combined with the railroads, the schools, and the churches, the citrus businesses started coming to Pinecastle. And since there were no roads, sometimes the packing plants moved right into the groves, which started the beginning of Pinecastle's booming commercial citrus industry. Citrus wasn't the only business booming in Pinecastle. The Atten Cash store seen here was one of the first businesses in Pinecastle and is the first known store to have been established in the Pinecastle community. With the railroad making regular stops in Pinecastle, it began to bring in new townspeople and visitors. Soon the Pinecastle Hotel was built in 1912. Pinecastle officially had all the components of a fully functioning town, and over the next few years, both Pinecastle and the surrounding communities began to grow, and in comes the 1920s. Pinecastle was a happening place to be. Soon the clay and sandy roads into town were replaced with an 8-foot wide brick road. So much traffic coming in and out of Pinecastle that a filling station had to be put in. And beautiful Lake Conway was home to more than several tourist attractions and gathering spots for locals to socialize and for recreation. Pleasure Beach was built on the site of Harney's famous Pinecastle home. Scotsman Beach was built on Hoffner, and Lakeside, which was a popular tourist attraction, was on South Orange Avenue, where the Police Benevolent Lodge is today. During World War II, Pinecastle became quite the hangout, and a dance pavilion was built on Pleasure Beach to accommodate those local soldiers that were stationed at Pinecastle Army Air Force Base. The Pinecastle Airfield was built in 1940, and in 1958 it was dedicated to Colonel Michael Norman Wright McCoy. Today, it is now the Orlando International Airport. Pinecastle Women's Club was also established in 1940. Throughout World War II, the Women's Club supported the troops through the Red Cross and built a memorial listing with the names of local men who also served in the war. Another company that helped out during the war was built in 1926 by Walter Maloon. It was built as the Florida Variety Boat Company located on Hoffner Avenue. It moved to Dixie Highway and became the Pinecastle Boat Company, and a few years later it became the world-famous Correct Craft. And in 1944, South Orange Avenue was closed down so that 300 boats could be commissioned for Eisenhower's troops so that they could cross the Rhine River and win World War II in Europe. Pinecastle began to grow in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and the Pinecastle Volunteer Fire Department was needed to protect new businesses, including the Craig Hotel, Randall Knives, Howard Fertilizer, Pinecastle Lumber and Hardware, and ABC. Jack Holloway owned ABC Paint Departments, celebrates in this photo. The developing new town gave way to many new clubs and organizations, such as the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts Club. The Girl Scouts had their own house where they would meet regularly. There were also sports teams, including a Little League team. There were tons of winners during those games, but they soon found out the biggest winner was the community. Today you'll see that many of these clubs still exist, although they've gone through some transformations. Here's the current Little League team of Pinecastle, Florida. And the Pinecastle Women's Club is still a staple in the heart of the Pinecastle community. Some of these events have changed in Pinecastle, but some have stayed the same. Almost 100 years later, we are still celebrating Pinecastle Pioneer Days. And now we have a few other new traditions, such as the Pinecastle Chili Cook-Off. That's not all that's changed in Pinecastle. With the newest technology available and the ever-growing need to be eco-friendly, we have now upgraded our train station to the Sunrail. Pinecastle even has its own stop on the Central Florida Sunrail, bringing things full circle from over 100 years ago when the first train came into Pinecastle, bringing in commerce and community. Today, we are honored to be part of the Pinecastle family, community, and tradition, and we look forward to expanding our own families in Pinecastle for many years to come. Today, there's a new opportunity in Pinecastle. There's a new movement in the Pinecastle community. Members and the leadership have now came together for a new initiative, and that is to bring the community in Pinecastle back to the people that live within the community. Somewhere in the 1930s, the town went bankrupt and it was taken over by the city of Orlando in Orange County. There are a lot of local rumors on how this happened and who was responsible, but ultimately we trace this back to the building of a water plant, and the city just wasn't in a position to afford the new growth. At the time, the taxes and income in the city generated could not accommodate the growth that the city needed to keep up with the Industrial Revolution and the innovation that came with the times. At this point, Pinecastle had to unfortunately reach out to Orange County and the city of Orlando to help and work together so Pinecastle could weather through the financial storm. Things have changed a lot since the early 1900s, and almost 100 years later, visually things have changed quite a bit in the Pinecastle community. Over the years, Pinecastle has began to grow with the new increase of family, new business, and an expanded community. This growth and the taxes, donations, and income that have made this possible has put Pinecastle in a new situation. The town of Pinecastle is now financially comfortable, and due to this new initiative has begun to start reinvesting and revitalizing the community. It was between 2016 and 2018 that we realized the community was now self-sufficient and sustainable, and in 2018 alone, we made close to $9 million in taxes. As we put together a budget, we realized that we can now accommodate the local needs of a small town to incorporate and to begin giving the town back to the people. The incorporation of Pinecastle gives the community an opportunity to see both the strengths and the weaknesses of the town of Pinecastle firsthand, without having to ask permission or check from our big brother at Orange County if we need to make some changes. We want to step away from the Orange County umbrella so we can focus on the things that the community needs the most, that we can see firsthand from being a part of the community, such as our own police force, our own fire department. This will greatly increase response times and make for a much safer community. As we have witnessed from our local neighbor Edgewater, who has created their own police force, they have had much better success in dealing with local crime and keeping the community safer than they did in previous situations with having to wait for Orange County. We're looking for a new beginning for Pinecastle, and this goes in every facet of the city, from community groups, organizations, waste disposal, police and fire department, town council, and the overall cleanliness and future of the city of Pinecastle. We have focused our budget on what we feel is the most important aspect of building a new community, a safer community, and a stronger community. We want to do this through increasing support and assistance to local community groups, programs, schools, and the community as a whole. With the recent expansion and addition of the Sunrail into a Pinecastle station, we're bringing a lot more visitors and commerce back into the Pinecastle community. We've put together these plans on expanding the community to be a better social environment for visitors as well as our local townspeople. We want Pinecastle to be a place for families who can easily come for a walk downtown in Pinecastle, to see local businesses, to have dinner, to maybe have an ice cream with the family. Now is the time for change, and we could use your help. If you would like to be involved in the incorporation of Pinecastle, please share this video, or you can visit us at our Facebook page at Save Historic Pinecastle or our website at savehistoricpinecastle.org. We look forward to hearing from you and helping us rebuild the Pinecastle community.